Chapter 19. "No!" Sydney screamed again. "You're dead! You're dead!" With a terrified sob, she flung out her hand to turn on her bedside light. Her hand hit the shade. The lamp wobbled and began to fall. "No!" Sydney scrambled off the bed, grabbed the lamp before it crashed to the floor. Grasping, Sydney switched it on. Backing against the wall, she held the lamp high. "Jason?" No one there. No one. "Sydney!" her father called from the hall. He knocked softly on the door. "I heard you yell. Are you all right?" I'm fine," Sydney called back in a trembling voice. "I had a bad dream. It seemed so real," she told herself, "but it was only a nightmare." "Sydney, are you sure you're all right?" her father asked. No, Sydney thought. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "Sure," she answered. "Sorry I woke you, Dad. Good night." "Night, honey." Sydney rose to her feet, her heart still pounding. Her hands shook as she set the lamp back on the table. Emma, she thought, I wish I could call her, tell her what I saw. Glancing at the clock, Sydney realized it was way too late to be making phone calls. Besides, it was only a nightmare. It had to be. Jason was dead, deep beneath the surface of Fear Lake. As she climbed into bed again, leaving the light on, Sydney wondered if Emma was having nightmares too. A buzzing sound filled Sydney's ears, a constant, annoying drone. Without opening her eyes, she flung her arm out and punched the snooze button on her alarm clock. "I'm so tired," she thought, snuggling her head deep into the pillow. So tired. And then she sat up straight, suddenly remembering all that had happened. Jason! Emma killed Jason last night. He died under the willow tree. She tied a rock to him and sank him in Fear Lake. And then I had that awful nightmare. Slowly, Sydney gazed at the foot of her bed. Jason had stood right there, she thought, bleeding and covered with mud, staring down at me, blaming me, his eyes filled with such hate. Sunlight poured in through the windows, warming the bedroom, but Sydney felt herself shivering. She drew the thick comforter around her shoulders and wrapped her arms around her knees. Jason is dead, she told herself. He's really dead. Still shivering, she leaned her head on her knees and took a shaky breath. Was she going to dream about him every night? Another buzz rang in her ears. Sydney jumped, then shut the alarm off. If she didn't get moving, she'd be late for school. It was the last place she wanted to go, but she knew she had to act normal. Pretend everything was fine. Pretend she hadn't watched Jason die, hadn't seen him lying face down in the mud under the willow tree. "Stop it," Sydney told herself. "Don't think about it anymore." Throwing off the bed cover, she hurried into her bathroom to get ready. The clothes she'd worn yesterday still lay in a muddy heap on the tile floor. With a shudder, she stuffed them into the hamper. After a fast shower, Sydney wrapped herself in a thick white robe. She stood in front of the mirror. Her eyes had dark circles under them. Her hand shook as she combed out her wet hair. The bathroom was steamy, but she still shivered. "You are totally messed up, but you have to go to school," she kept telling herself. "You have to act as if everything is normal." The comb tangled in her hair. She slammed the comb down and hurried out of the bathroom. In her walk-in closet, Sydney studied the long rows of clothes and tried to decide what to wear. Jeans? A skirt? Something colorful? Or something black? What do you wear the day after you helped kill your boyfriend? "Stop it," she ordered herself again. "Just pick something and go to school." Sydney grabbed jeans and a cinnamon-colored blouse. As she started to the bed, she stopped. "No," she thought. "No!" Her ears rang and her pulse raced. Shaking her head, she took 2 more steps and stared at the carpet at the foot of her bed. Deep in the ivory carpet, she saw 2 footprints. 2 muddy footprints. Jason's footprints. Chapter 20. "It had to be a dream, Sydney." Emma slammed her locker and snapped the lock. Sydney tensely twisted a strand of hair around her pointer finger. "But what about the footprints, Emma?" she asked, her voice rising. "They didn't vanish the way Jason did. They were there this morning, oozing mud into the carpet." "Shh," Emma hissed, nudging Sydney's arm. "You want somebody to hear you?" Sydney glanced around the hall. Kids were hurrying to the first class of the day. "Of course not," she whispered, "but those footprints really freaked me out, Emma. I didn't dream those footprints. They were definitely real." "Okay, they were," Emma agreed. "And I just realized how they got there." "How?" It's easy to explain. We were both out in the muddy woods, right? Emma pointed out. So the footprints were yours. Sydney stared at her. You think? Of course, Emma insisted. I was totally covered in mud and gunk when I got home last night. My clothes were a disaster, and so were my shoes. Weren't yours? Sydney nodded slowly. Plus, you were totally freaked, Emma reminded her softly. You weren't paying any attention to where you walked or stood. You just wanted to get out of those wet, filthy clothes, right? Right. I was practically hysterical, Sydney admitted. I don't remember much, except that I took a bath. She took a shaky breath. I guess you're right. They could be my footprints. They are yours, Emma corrected her. I know it was an awful dream, Sid, but come on, we both know dreams don't leave footprints. Emma has to be right, Sydney thought, as she watched her friend hurry to her first class. She has to be right. Hey, Sydney. Tori Johnson smiled as they walked out of English together. Where's Jason? Sydney's heart raced. She felt her face grow hot. I'm not sure. Tori raised her eyebrows skeptically. You two are always together. How could you not know where he is? She stared at Sydney as if searching for the answer in her eyes. Then she gasped. Don't tell me you broke up with Jason. No, I just helped kill him, Sydney thought. The image of Jason standing at her bed flashed through her mind again. She shook it away and forced a smile. No, we didn't break up, she said. I just haven't seen him today, that's all. He must be out sick. Tori nodded and sped off down the hall. Sydney sighed and went in the other direction, toward her locker. Tori wasn't the only one who'd asked her about Jason today. It seemed as if the entire school wanted to know where he was and why they weren't together. And every time someone asked, Sydney's heartbeat speeded up and she blushed. She was such a terrible liar. It was a miracle that anyone believed a word she said. Someone tapped her shoulder. Startled, Sydney whirled around. Kurt Walters, a guy from her history class, stood grinning at her. Sorry, did I scare you? A little. Laughing nervously, Sydney began walking again. Kurt fell into step with her. That history test was really tough, huh? How do you think you did? Probably flunked it, Sydney muttered. At least that wasn't a lie. Everything she knew about the Civil War had vanished from her mind. Yeah, well, join the club, Kurt told her. Hey, where's Jason? Not again, Sydney thought. Why did I ever come here today? I should have known people would wonder why Jason and I aren't together. Kurt stared at her. So, is he around? No. Sydney bit her lip and glanced away, wondering if Kurt could hear her heart jackhammering in her chest. I haven't seen him. Have you? If I had, I wouldn't be asking you. Oh, right. Sydney forced a laugh. I think he must be sick. Yeah, I guess. Kurt gave her another curious glance, then shrugged. Well, see you. Sure. He knew I was lying, Sydney thought as Kurt walked away. He could tell. Sydney sighed. She was the one who told Emma they had to act normal today, but she had practically jumped out of her skin the first time anyone asked her about Jason. At least the day is over, she thought as she approached her locker. She could go home, take another long bath, and try to forget about Jason. As Sydney opened her locker, something slipped from the shelf and fell to the floor. She glanced down. At her feet lay a small envelope, folded in half. Huh? She hadn't put any envelope in there. Maybe it was a flyer for a bake sale or something. Curious, Sydney bent down and picked it up. Her fingers touched something moist. Mud. A smear of damp mud covered the front of the envelope. Sydney shivered, remembering the muddy footprints on her carpet. Get a grip, she told herself. It rained again this morning. Everything is muddy. Sydney turned the envelope over. Something heavy slid to one corner. She ran her fingers over the bulge. Definitely not a flyer. Quickly, she ripped open the envelope and peered inside. Something gold glinted up at her. Her hands shook as she slid it into her palm and stared at it. A ring. A Shadyside High School ring, with the owner's initials carved into it. J.P. Jason Phillips. Jason's ring, Sydney realized. I saw it on his hand last night. Chapter 21. A dull roar filled Sydney's ears. Her vision blurred. The hallway started to spin. Her hand shook so badly she had to squeeze her fingers around the ring to keep from dropping it. Jason wore this ring last night, her mind screamed. I saw it on his finger. I saw it gleaming when he was shoveling under the tree. How did it get here? Sydney slowly uncurled her fingers. Jason's ring gleamed in the palm of her hand. No, she whispered, shaking her head violently. No. Sydney, what's wrong? Startled, Sydney turned quickly, banging her shoulder on a sharp edge of her locker door. Emma stared at her, a concerned expression on her face. Emma, Sydney whispered in a hoarse voice, you're not going to believe this. Believe what? Emma asked, frowning. What is the matter with you, Sid? I saw you shaking your head and mumbling to yourself. Look. Sydney opened her fingers and held out the ring. It's Jason's school ring. Emma's eyes bulged. I found it in my locker, inside that envelope. Sydney pointed to the muddy envelope that had fallen to the floor. See the mud? It's still damp. Sid? How did Jason's ring get in my locker? Sydney demanded shrilly. He was wearing it when he... Last night. I saw it, Emma. I saw it on his hand. I know I did. So how did it get here? Sydney, calm down and let me think, Emma replied impatiently. I don't remember seeing it last night, Sid. Are you sure he was wearing it? Yes, I'm sure. Well, almost. Well, maybe you just thought you saw it, Emma suggested. Anyway, Jason could have left it here yesterday. He used her locker before, right? Right, but... And the gym is just down the hall, Emma continued. So maybe he put it in here before gym class, so he wouldn't lose it. But, Emma, I went to my locker 2 times today, Sydney argued, and the envelope wasn't there. Are you sure? Sydney closed her eyes and tried to remember. She had gone to her locker that morning, hung up her jacket, taken out some notebooks. Then after lunch, she had put away the morning notebooks and taken out the ones she needed for afternoon class. Well, Emma asked. I'm pretty sure it wasn't there, Sydney told her. She sighed. But, I'm not sure of anything anymore. Then I bet the ring was in your locker all this time, Emma declared. It was probably stuck to a book or something. Do you think so? Come on, it had to be there, Emma insisted. There's no other explanation. Sydney stared at her, still shaken. First the muddy footprints, she murmured. Now this. I thought... Stop thinking about it, Emma squeezed her arm. You're freaking, Sydney. You have to get a grip. I'm trying, Sydney cried. But everybody keeps asking me about... She glanced around and lowered her voice. About Jason. Where is he? Why isn't he with me? It's driving me crazy. And now I find his school ring in my locker? I know, but it must have been there already and you just missed it. Emma squeezed Sydney's arm again. That's what happened, Sid. Please don't fall apart. Sydney forced herself to breathe deeply. Emma was probably right about the ring, she thought. And she was definitely right about falling apart. You have to get a grip, Sydney ordered herself. You have to. Sydney stuffed Jason's ring into the pocket of her jeans. Then she raked her fingers through her hair and managed a smile. I'm better now, she murmured. I'll be okay. Good, Emma smiled back. Come on, let's get out of here. Today was the worst. It will get easier after this. I hope so, Sydney thought. I can't take many more days like this. Sydney grabbed her jacket. Do you want me to drop you off at the Cineplex? She asked as they walked down the hall. No, but you can give me a ride home, Emma told her. Aren't you working? I called and said my head is still bothering me. Emma touched it and winced. It was no lie, either. It's pounding right this very minute. I'm going to lie down as soon as I get home. Me too, Sydney thought, pushing open the doors that led to the student parking lot. I'll take a hot bath, and then I'll take a nap. I just hope I don't dream about Jason. Clouds covered the sky outside, but the rain had let up. Skirting the puddles, Sydney and Emma hurried through the parking lot to the car. Emma pulled open the door and began to toss her backpack inside. Oh, no, she gasped. What? What's wrong? Sydney cried. Emma's face had gone pale. Her finger shook as she pointed. Look! Sydney stared into her car and felt a cold wave of fear ripple up her spine. A shovel lay on the seat caked with mud. But not just mud, Sydney realized. Splotches of blood. Dark red blood, still shiny and wet, smeared the shovel and dripped onto the pale beige seat cushion of her car. Chapter 22. But how did it get here? She sputtered. What is that thing doing in my car? I don't know, Emma wailed. I didn't put it there last night. What do you mean? Sydney demanded. What did you do with it last night? Didn't you hide it? Let me think. Emma squeezed her eyes shut. After I hit Jason, I tossed the shovel down, she said slowly. I forgot all about it. I never went back and picked it up. So how did it get into my car? Sydney demanded. I'm telling you, I don't know, Emma cried. She glanced back at the shovel, then gasped. Sydney, someone must have seen us. Another ripple of fear shot up Sydney's spine. You heard voices, right? Emma asked. When I came back from burying Jason in the lake, you told me you heard people talking, remember? I remember. Sydney clenched her jaw to keep her teeth from chattering. I thought you were just freaked, Emma continued. But I was wrong. You were right, Sid. Someone else must have been in the woods. Someone watching us, Sydney thought with a shudder. Hiding and watching. Whoever it was found the shovel, Sid, Emma cried, and they put it in your car to threaten us. Threaten us? Why? Sydney whispered hoarsely. I mean, do you think they saw what happened with Jason? Or did they just find the shovel after they saw us running away? Why did they put it in my car? What do they want? She couldn't keep the panic from raising her voice high and shrill. We'll have to wait and find out, I guess, Emma replied with a shudder. I'm scared, Sid. Me too, Sydney thought. But I'm not just scared, I'm terrified. She glanced into the car again. The shovel still lay there, smearing mud and blood onto the seat cushion. With a cry, she grabbed the shovel, dragged it out of the car, and shut it in the trunk. What should we do now? She asked breathlessly, climbing into the driver's seat. I'm not sure, Emma replied. She wiped the mud off her seat and got into the car. But we're both too scared to think right now. We might do something dumb. Let's go to your house and try to calm down. Then we can talk about what to do. Okay. Sydney's hand shook badly as she jabbed the key at the ignition. She finally got it in on the third try, and the engine roared to life. As she peeled out of the parking lot, she hit a speed bump so hard that her head banged the car roof. Slow down, Emma warned. The last thing that you want right now is a speeding ticket. She's right, Sydney knew. If I got stopped now, I'd totally fall apart. Easing up on the gas, she glanced at Emma. Should we take the shovel and hide it someplace? She asked. Should we bury it, maybe? Or wash all the blood off and then take it back to my house? Emma shook her head. Someone might be watching us, remember? Sydney's stomach flipped over. Her heart pounding, she raised her eyes to the rearview mirror. That blue car trailing behind her. Had it been there all along? Keeping her eyes on the mirror, Sydney drove north on Park Drive. The blue car stayed with her. Sweat broke out on her forehead. She gripped the wheel and forced herself not to push the gas pedal to the floor. 1 block. 2 blocks. The blue car stuck with her. Sydney turned into the North Hill section of Shadyside. The blue car followed. Who is it? She wondered. Someone who saw us in the woods? Emma, she finally murmured. Check out the blue car behind us. Emma quickly turned in her seat. What blue car? Sydney glanced in the mirror. Behind her stretched an empty road. It was there, Sydney insisted. I believe you, Emma told her. Did it tailgate you or something? No, I just thought it was following us. I guess I'm feeling totally paranoid. Breathing a sigh of relief, Sydney drove carefully through North Hills. 10 minutes later, she pulled her car into the garage. She and Emma entered her house. Her parents weren't home, thank goodness. The day's mail lay on the foyer table. It had been separated into 3 piles, Sydney's, her mother's, and her father's. Sydney grabbed her pile, then led Emma into the kitchen and took 2 cans of soda from the refrigerator. Come on, let's go to my room before anybody else gets home. The last thing I want to do is answer questions about how my day was and how I did on the history test. In her bedroom, Sydney tossed down her backpack and mail. The mail scattered across the rug. A magazine, a bill for the insurance on her car, and a plain white envelope with no return address. Curious, she picked up the envelope. She put her soda can on the night table, then sat on the bed and ripped open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of white paper, folded in half. As Sydney unfolded it and read the typewritten words, a wave of dizziness washed over her. What's wrong? Emma asked. Your face just got totally white? Still dizzy, Sydney licked her lips and clutched the letter tightly. Sid? What's wrong? Emma repeated. What does it say? Sydney cleared her throat. I saw you in the woods, she read in a trembling voice. I know your name. It's Murderer. Chapter 23. Sydney heard a whirring in her ears as if she were in a wind tunnel. Letting the note fall from her hand, she gazed across the room at Emma. Emma stared back, her blue eyes wide and frightened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Sydney whispered, This isn't a nightmare, and I'm not being paranoid. This is really happening. Emma snatched up the note and read it herself. Sydney drew her legs onto the bed and wrapped her arms around her knees. What are we going to do? She cried hoarsely. Somebody knows what happened, Emma. Someone knows that we murdered Jason. Emma raked her fingers through her long blonde hair. No one can prove we killed him, she declared. I mean, Jason hasn't even been found yet, and when he is found, we have each other as alibis. But Emma, Sydney cried, if somebody was watching, then they must know where you put Jason's body. Emma didn't respond, but her face turned pale. She crumpled the note and tossed it into the wastepaper basket. Sydney couldn't sit still. She slid off the bed and began to pace the room, twisting a strand of hair around her finger as she walked back and forth. Sydney, sit down, will you? Emma pleaded. You're making me even more nervous. I can't help it. Sydney paced some more, then stopped suddenly. My belt, she gasped, spinning around to face Emma. Huh? What about it? You used it to tie that rock around Jason. Emma, we have to go back and get my belt before anyone finds it. No way, Emma cried. We're not going back to the lake. I'm telling you, Sid, whoever sent that note doesn't know what really happened. They're bluffing. What makes you so sure? Sydney demanded. Well, Emma finally shook her head. I guess I can't be positive, she admitted. So we have to go back, Sydney repeated. We have to get my belt, and we have to hide the body someplace else. Half an hour later, Sydney followed Emma through the thick tangle of weeds and bushes toward Fear Lake. I've never been so scared in my life, she thought. Scared of moving Jason, of touching his dead body, scared of getting caught. Something brushed across Sydney's face. She jumped back with a cry. Emma glanced over her shoulder. Just a tree branch, Sid. Come on, we're almost there. Sydney forced herself to keep going. I can't believe I'm doing this, she thought. I can't believe I got myself into this mess because of some stupid money. Up ahead, Emma climbed over a fallen log, then disappeared through some thick undergrowth. Sydney hurried to catch up. She jumped over the log, then scrambled through the tangle of bushes, emerging at Emma's side. 10 feet ahead of them stood Fear Lake. A breeze blew across the water, making small waves that lapped against the shoreline. It was late afternoon. Clouds filled the sky, and the water of Fear Lake lapped softly, dark and cold. Sydney gazed out at it, her heart pounding. Are you sure this is the right place? She whispered. Emma nodded. I remember that log back there. I had to drag Jason's body around it. Didn't you see how the weeds were flattened? No, Sydney shuddered and hugged herself. I wasn't exactly paying attention. Okay, let's get it over with. Emma took a deep breath, then stepped to the edge of the lake. Sydney followed, her knees feeling like jelly. How far out did you take him? She asked. Not far, Emma replied. There's a drop-off a little way out. You feel like you're stepping off a cliff, but it's really only a few feet down to a sort of underwater ledge. I rolled him down onto it. Come on! Leaving their shoes and socks on the shore, they rolled up their jeans and waded into the icy water. Sydney shuddered again as strings of algae wrapped themselves around her ankles. Is Jason covered with algae? She wondered. Have the fish discovered him? Will he be bloated and bitten like bodies in the movies? Don't think about it, she told herself. You'll go crazy if you think about it. She wiped the slimy scum off and trudged forward. When the water reached almost to her knees, Emma stopped wading. This is it, she told Sydney. She pointed to an old wooden shed not far from where they stood. I remember looking at that pier when I was out here. We're in the exact same spot now. Okay, let's do it. Sydney shoved her sleeves up, then plunged her hands into the water. Her fingers grasped pond scum, soft and slimy. She stuck her arms down further. Rocks, sand, more pond scum. No Jason. She raised her eyes to Emma. Did you find him? Not yet. Emma's long hair spread out across the water as she bent over, plunging her arms in deeper. After a moment, she straightened up. Her hair dripped and her hands held nothing but algae. He should be right here, she cried. This is where I put him. Sydney waded in deeper until the water reached halfway up her thighs. We have to get my belt back before his body is found, she thought. He couldn't be any farther out, Emma gasped as she struggled through water up to her waist. There's no tide or anything. I know. We'll find him, Sydney declared, her teeth chattering. We have to find him. The sky grew darker. Sydney's feet felt like blocks of ice. Her hands and arms turned numb. I don't get it, Emma sighed. I just don't understand why we can't find him. Sydney's whole body shook with cold. She stared out at the murky waters. It's useless to keep looking, she realized. Jason is not here. His body is gone.